Good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here. We're going to give everyone just a minute to get logged in, and then we will get started. I want to let you know we do have the chat open and our Q&A. If you have any questions or comments that you would like to contribute throughout the program, please feel free to submit those. I'll be watching that for our panelists, and we will be able to get those as they come in. Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for being here for the second book in our Let's Talk About It series, the Science of Sustainability. Today, we're happy to present the book, The Hidden Connections by Fritjof Capra. Our panelists today are all Southwestern alumni. We have Matthew Barnes. He's an associate professor in the Department of Natural Resources Management at Texas Tech University, where his teaching and research focus on aquatic ecology, biology invasions, and detection of organisms using forensic environmental DNA technology. Barnes is married to a Southwestern sweetheart, Erin Reddy Barnes, and they have 2 children and 2 cats. Kira Mcintyre is an assistant professor of biology at Queen's University of Charlotte. She earned her PhD from the Warnell School of Forestry and Natural Resources at the University of Georgia, where she conducted research exploring the interface between psychology, behavior, and population ecology for salamanders in a complex landscape. Then she pursued her passion for teaching as visiting assistant professor of biology at Trinity University in San Antonio for 2 years. She's passionate about using best teaching practices and broadly interested in behavioral ecology and conservation. She does extensive individual agent-based modeling and is currently collaborating on a couple of different projects. Her current research with students is in transition, but will center around behavioral ecology and maintenance of polymorphisms in reptiles and amphibians. And Audrey Calhoun is a sustainability professional MBA graduate and is a 2013 Southwestern grad who studied environmental studies and minored in business and religion. She earned an MBA with a focus on sustainability from the University of Colorado Boulder in 2019 and has worked for various nonprofits and is now pursuing a full-time position as a sustainability professional looking for jobs where she can help companies track and improve their energy and water efficiency and waste diversion rates, as well as maintain environmental and social impact reporting and certifications. Currently, she is a park host at Lake Mineral Wells State Park, living in a camp at the park and helping with interpretive programs like nature hikes, bird bingo, and scavenger hunts. Sounds like fun. Help me welcome them, and I will turn the program over to them. Thank you so much for being here.
All right. Thank you, Serena. So my name's Audrey. And like Serena said, I am currently a campground host for Lake Mineral Wells State Park here in Texas. It's in north central Texas, 45 minutes west of Fort Worth. And it's been really great so far. So I am in Fort Worth currently because I do not have reliable Wi-Fi or service out at the park. So came in for my camper today, but I'll be going back out there and then job hunting otherwise, and probably going to be pursuing a Sustainability Excellence Associate certification here, which is just run by the International Society of Sustainability Professionals, just one of the many certifications that you can get that will hopefully help you land a great job later on. Yeah, and then went to school with Kira, and I think she's going to be next.
Yep. Yeah, it was fun whenever we got invited to be panelists, and I don't think Audrey or either of us knew the other one was going to be a panelist. So I was like, oh, hey, I know you. That's fun. But I think I'll just kind of start talking about the book a little bit. And one of the things that I think Dr. Barnes and I found really interesting when we were just talking about it before you guys all joined us is that this was published in 2002, which is 19 years ago, which is kind of remarkable that a lot of what is being said in there is still relevant. But some of it I think may be a little bit outdated in thinking. And so it was kind of interesting to read this in today's context and try and think about how it relates to what we currently know about biology and sustainability and what still hasn't happened that was proposed by our lovely author back in 2002. It's hard to believe that that has been such a long time ago. But I think one of the things that I found most sort of outdated in thinking was the discussion about GMOs, or genetically modified organisms. This book was very, very much against the idea of GMOs, but all of the science that I know now has shown that they're fairly harmless to the surrounding environment. There have not been any evidence of additional gene jumping transfers or anything like that. And so, yeah, I thought that was kind of interesting, but I think that the author really underestimated just how much globalization would become a part of society and how social networks are mentioned in here, but I don't think that they understood just the degree to which they would become an important part of daily life. So I thought that was kind of interesting. What about you guys?
So one thing that I'm glad you brought up the social networks too, because yeah, this book was written in 2002. Facebook started in 2004, and Twitter started in 2006. And so, you know, it was fascinating to me that I don't think Capra could have even imagined or fathomed what the social network was going to be. And it's interesting, you know, what I've been trying to play with in my mind is how does his, especially in his sociology chapter and his discussions about culture, how do those play out in current social media and the way, for example, Facebook functioned in the previous two elections, right? Because I think a major message of the book, or one that I got from it, was talking about how thinking about these networks as a way to get the whole system to function more efficiently and better together. Thinking about how this sort of democratization of information and how the ease of the sharing of information and the ability for us to connect with people around the globe with Facebook and Twitter. I think, at least in 2002, Capra would have said, man, this is going to be such a great thing. I can't possibly see a single drawback to this tool that would allow us and to communicate to communicate our message to everybody around the globe. And I wonder what his thoughts are. I didn't Google it. Google, a company that came out a couple of years before the book was written, and probably also something we ought to talk about. But thinking about social media for now, I wonder what his impression of social media would be. And I wonder if y'all have any thoughts on how well things like Facebook and Twitter fit with his heralding of networking, or how have they revealed sort of a darker side or unintended consequences, and why?
I have some thoughts on that, but Audrey, would you like to go first?
Yeah, well, I mean, yeah, I was definitely thinking and very aware while reading the book that it was published in 2002, and just thinking, yeah, well, okay, so when I first started it, I definitely expected it to come across as a lot more dated than it actually did. So that was kind of a pleasant surprise going through it. But then there were obviously things that I don't know who could have foreseen them of, Facebook, Amazon taking off like it did, Google, all of these things that are just kind of standards now, he wouldn't have either known about because they didn't exist, or they were just in their infancy in such a different form than they are today. I think, for one thing, it just speeds up the ability of these networks to kind of change, like language can change so fast. And even if we look at kind of not set languages, like, let's not even talk about like English, like the language of like memes or different things like that, of just this way of communicating that I don't know that we would have, who would have thought 20 years ago, oh, we're going to quickly be able to communicate what we're thinking and our reaction to someone by showing them an image, and they're going to know what we intend from that, even if it's a stranger, halfway across the world. So I don't think he could have had any idea about that.
Going back to pictograms.
Yeah, exactly. Just with a lot faster response time.
Yeah. You don't have to carve them in stone. It goes a lot faster that way. I also think that one thing that he touts social networks as being like this amazing way to communicate and like, really get diverse ideas across. And I don't think he anticipated the echo chambers that actually have happened. And what was really fascinating this past semester is I ended up with an echo chamber in a discussion board of like 15 students in one of my classes, which was really fascinating, because the topic of this course that I'm teaching is biological heroes and villains. And so the idea is like using evidence to like decide if something is a hero or villain, and like, is science really unbiased, or do we actually paint things in one way or another, and like kind of trying to get them to be a little bit more critical in their thinking. It's a general ed class, so they're all non-biology, mostly non-science majors. And so I had them watch some probably also very dated videos from PBS about evolution, which were still great. It got the basic concepts across, but one of the last ones was talking about how controversial it was. And so I asked them on the discussion board about, like, had they seen the controversy? Like, were they aware of it? Like, was it something they saw in high school and that sort of thing? And it became an echo chamber where like the first post was a really awesome like in-depth discussion about how religion and science aren't counter to each other, they actually can live in harmony quite easily, and like it was really well explained, really eloquent, and it had a bunch of comments on it that were all in agreement. Maybe, I don't know, 5 or 6 posts down there was a comment about how they just couldn't understand how evolution and religion could possibly ever coexist, and there's just no way that this, that they can be symbiotic, and like they didn't use that word, but like they just could not understand this. And they had a couple of comments on it. Oh yeah, like it's so nice to hear someone else say it about how like this just goes against my religious beliefs. And I was just like, did you guys read like everyone's posts or just a couple? And I asked them that later, and they were like, yeah, we only read a few. And I was like, okay, go read the rest of them, because your classmates have great responses to exactly what you're saying. But I found it really interesting that what they were gravitating to engaging with were things that agreed with what they already thought. And I was like, wow, that was an unintentional small social experiment that I just performed on my 15 students. And I think that has been seen in a much larger scale on all of these social networks. And so I definitely think that's something that was not anticipated by anyone, much less the whole fake news evolution, but we don't need to get into that.
Sure. So one thing I thought about, and even this example of social media as these echo chambers sort of fits as well, is this idea. So we were joking right before we turned the chat on about how to pronounce the word autopoiesis, right? So autopoiesis, this idea that that the early life forms, these early pseudo cells, and then moving on to DNA and moving on to cellular life and multicellular life, and that life is self-generating, self-sustaining. And then I think I think Capra does a compelling job talking about the parallels with society and culture, and how there are self-perpetuating, self-sustaining elements of the cognitive and social domains as well. But I wonder if this idea of strength in numbers, of finding people in a network that share your thoughts, and bonding with those people, and finding those messages that resonate with you. I wonder if this is, again, an unintended consequence, or is this also captured in this idea of autopoiesis? Do we drift towards hearing ideas that agree with what we've got in our head because it's comfortable and familiar to us? I had to go. So even, for example, reading this book, I shared your eye rolling in the biotechnology chapter, because there's essentially zero evidence that GMO foods have any human health impacts, right? But I had to work hard to read that chapter. And I went back online over the last couple of days and did some Googling to try and confirm, to make sure that I wasn't missing on anything, missing out on any information deliberately. And so I just wonder if this aligning ourselves with people of similar thoughts and these sort of echo chambers are just an extension of this idea that we're self-sustaining and trying to perpetuate our point of view.
Unfortunately, I don't think that results in a more sustainable world, because you end up with sort of disjunct echo chambers of sustainable ideas and not so sustainable ideas. And I mean, he does make a good point that a lot of the GMOs aren't actually being used in a way that they could be, where they could be used to maximize like the production of food on a smaller amount of land, and therefore move, actually solve some social issues about food insecurity and things like that. And that is still a valid point. Most of the corn that's grown in the US is inedible, as an example. But yeah, I don't know. I see a question in the chat box as well.
Yeah, so the question's been brought up. As scientists, we believe that our training has reduced our inherent bias. Do you have any suggestions to continue to challenge our biases and prevent ourselves from getting stuck in an echo chamber?
It's a really good question. I think the first step is to recognize when you might be in an echo chamber and to seek out the other side, as Dr. Barnes was bringing up. He went and looked, like, is there something I've missed? Because I haven't seen anything about this being, harmful to people and to human health. And I think that's true of implicit biases of everything, and not just in science. But the first step is acknowledging that you have it, recognizing when you're experiencing some sort of bias, and then taking a step towards changing it. And so I think that is kind of the way that I would try to challenge myself to continue challenging biases is, am I accepting what I'm reading in this scientific article because I trust the source and because it aligns with what I believe? Or am I accepting it because their methods make sense and it seems their conclusions are backed up by what they found? And does that align with what other scientists have found, and things like that. Kind of an interesting quandary, I guess, that has come up relatively recently about ocean acidification and fish is there was a lot of evidence to suggest that it messed with the way that they could navigate. And then one paper found that it didn't. And so it was like, well, both of these things are true as far as we know. So how do we make them make sense? And that is the ultimate challenge of science. What do you guys think?
Yeah, I would say I'm not really on the scientist path any longer at this point in my life. But I definitely do think like bias comes up in kind of no matter what you are studying or learning or doing, it's part of being human. So definitely acknowledging it is the first step, of course. But then, yeah, I would say do the research. Sometimes if you just have some thoughts, be like, why do I think this? Like, why do I believe this? Go kind of down the rabbit holes and pursue the studies that might have been done, or like look for the facts that can back up your beliefs, or maybe somebody else's. Definitely be open to listening to other people, but then also maybe be willing to do the work that they may or may not be willing to do, which is go get the facts and go see if you can actually find the answer. Sometimes it's really, really easy. It's just kind of stopping, pausing, saying, kind of like, let me go look at this for a minute, and then just kind of doing the research, which is often just like Googling and then paying attention to the sources and not just trusting anything on the internet. So yeah, I would say definitely just kind of acknowledge, first off, nothing wrong with having bias. That's perfectly human. And then just moving past it and trying to acknowledge, we all have it, but how can I bring in some other resources? How can I make sure that, what I'm looking at is true to the best of my knowledge? So yeah, definitely I would say just doing the work and kind of going down the rabbit holes to try to figure out if the beliefs that you hold can be backed up to some extent.
And I agree fully with all of those recommendations. The other point I would make too is to surround yourself with different perspectives, right? And this is as whether you're a scientist in a department at a university or in a company. This is recommendations like making sure that diversity is something that you are hiring, that you are evaluating in hiring, and that you're promoting diversity in your workplace and in your group of people that you hang out with, that you associate with, because those different perspectives, even if they don't apparently, it may not seem obvious what a male perspective versus a female perspective would be on theories of evolution or something like that. But I think surrounding yourself by diversity is really essential to make sure that there's all the different positions are represented.
And I would add on to that, diversity is like, that encompasses so many different things. So don't just get stuck on like skin color or gender. And within a company that can entail, bring people from different kind of silos. So bring in somebody from accounting, bring in somebody who's doing the research, bring in somebody from all these different kind of fields, and you're going to get a lot better, stronger decision making than if it was just, the same group of people at the head who maybe don't have kind of their boots on the ground and like don't have necessarily the best understanding of what's happening within the organization itself. So definitely diversity, think about it in all its kind of many, many different ways that it can be played out. And it's hard, definitely, to really be inclusive and to build a really inclusive organization, but it's worth it because it does make the organization so much better as a whole.
This is such a great recommendation, right? What else is diverse? Experts and non-experts, right? So have these conversations some of the greatest sort of insights into my field, aquatic community ecology, have come when I've been talking about my research and things that I do with someone from the math department or the sociology department, because there are really smart people out there that may not be experts in your field, but they have really strong critical thinking skills. They have the ability to ask questions that might make you think about your own questions differently and your own research differently. So absolutely, thinking about that idea of diversity really broadly is important. And you know what? The good news, Bianca, is that Southwestern has prepared us, I think, really well for that. Right? In my day, we called them POKs, perspective on knowledge courses. But there was that core curriculum that you had to take a class in sociology and a class in biology, and from all across the university. That liberal arts education is really valuable for doing just this that we're talking about. And you know, it continues to be useful. So when I was at Southwestern, I was a biology major. I was a sociology minor. I was just short sociology methods. I can't remember exactly. I think it was called research methods or something like that. I was missing one class, and I could have double majored. So I do consider myself a biologist and a sociologist, and this book was a great opportunity to engage both of those perspectives. And I have, over the last 20 years or so, because I actually started at Southwestern just about the time that this book was published, but over the last 20 years or so, or 16 years or so, my sociology muscle has not gotten quite as much work as my biology, and so reading the book, I think, pushed me out of my comfort zone a little bit, and this conversation continues to push me out of my comfort zone a little bit, because we have honed in on all the, I think we've jumped on the social and cultural things right away, rather than talking about you know, the mechanisms of evolution, and whether Capra's ideas about the importance of mutation being the least important part of the evolutionary process. I'd love to return to those, but in any case, yeah, I think we're well prepared for these sort of for thinking about different perspectives and different and celebrating, engaging that diversity, and a lot of that is because of the type of education that people in this room received.
And I think another big part of it is the willingness to learn, unlearn, and relearn. So recognizing that, you know, information is not static, and it's okay to change your mind if you learn more information. Like, that's okay. It's kind of stigmatized in American society of like, oh, well, then you just, you know, where do you even stand? And it's like, well, I stand with whatever's currently like best of knowledge. Like that's where I'm at. And I think the pandemic has been a really great demonstration of that, where at first the CDC was like, you know, we're not really sure if masks are going to be the best option. And then they're like, no, actually, we've done a bunch of studies and they definitely make a huge difference. Please wear a mask. So like, it's knowledge changes, and being willing to accept that and being open to that, I think, will also help you keep out of those echo chambers. But something that Matt said, I would love to talk about too, about the idea that mutations aren't really that important. Do you want to elaborate on that point a little bit, and then I will also give my opinion.
Well, okay, so so I'd love to hear your point on the mutations not being that important. Sort of broadening. Let me zoom out just a little bit, and I'm sure you'll have some thoughts on this as well. I felt like I really connected with an awful lot of the biology chapter. I think in my field in ecology, we continue to recognize and sort of become more sophisticated on how context dependent food webs and the populations and communities are. We continue to increase our, I don't know about understanding, but appreciation for the fact that really complex, dynamic things happen when you get a bunch of organisms and populations together. And there really are emergent properties that happen that you can't quite predict from lower levels of organization as you scroll up to larger levels of organization. And I'm an aquatic scientist, so I'll use the example of fish schooling, right? There's nothing about an individual fish that would lead you to predict that it would behave as a schooling fish if you put a big group of them together. Yet it happens.
And there's really cool like hydrodynamics and stuff about schools of fish, but I digress.
Sure. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So challenge.
There's like cool biomechanics about that, but anyway.
Okay. All right. The thing that I think was missing, or the thing that I think was my big beef with the biology chapter, is he seemed to imply over and over again that evolution, that evolution was intentional, and that organisms are changing so that they can be better suited to their environment. Sort of implying that a giraffe chose to make its neck longer so it could reach the top of the tallest trees. And he even mentioned Lovelock's Gaia hypothesis, which also made me roll my eyes. This idea that I wrote down some notes here. Evolution isn't intentional. Positive and negative feedback loops are not intentional. They result in directionality, right? We can point to why giraffe necks got longer over time, and how that was descent with modification, that was natural selection acting on beneficial traits. But this idea that these random mutations are the least important factor, and that evolution is somehow intentional and some form of like deliberate problem solving is just a little too hippy dippy for me.
A little cringy.
Yeah.
I feel like I'm in my intro bio classes all over again, and I'm reteaching them right now, so for recent flashbacks. Yeah. Although most mutations don't result in any sort of selection pressure, mutations are the foundation of what evolution evolution by natural selection selects upon. And something that I constantly am correcting my students on is the idea that evolution always happens with natural selection, because people equate the two in their head. They're like, this is the same thing. And it's like, no, they're not. Like, evolution is a change in allele frequency. That can happen randomly. Like, there can be no intentionality to it. There can be no harm to it. So we started doing some field studies in our like foundations of biodiversity and ecology class this past couple of weeks, and one of my students got really like excited because we have these blue violets that are blooming right now. Some of them are bright purple, like dark purple, and some of them are white with blue stripes, and they are the same species, and as far as we can tell, no one really knows why there's that much variation. In my field guide, it's just like they can range from white to dark purple, and it's like, okay. And so it's interesting because like you know, that kind of thing are the things that we observe, is we observe differences, and sometimes they matter and sometimes they don't. And I'm wondering with the flowers, for example, if perhaps to a bee they look the same. If you're looking at ultraviolet light, it doesn't matter, and so they're selecting for both phenotypes, and so they're still being perpetuated in the environment. This is what I suspect is happening, but again, the research hasn't been done, so we don't really know. But like, there could be a change in allele frequency for some random reason of, like, one year there's more that are blue and white, and the next year there's more purple, and like that could happen for no particular reason in the population. However, evolution by natural selection has this directionality because, like you said, there are selection pressures that are selecting on the variation that exists. So I recently have been working on a paper about that concept of how important variation is in all levels of organization of biology, and how sometimes that variation is very predictable. Like, you can have different alleles that you can say, okay, like this allele produces this phenotype, and that's very predictable, and we're going to get variation in the population. But sometimes there's also this unpredictability about variation, where you have the same allele, and the author touched on this a bit, but there may be some other genetic factors at play that cause differences in expression. So you end up with more phenotypic variation than if you just look at the genes, which is something that I think he overemphasized a little bit, that he was just like, it's not enough to just say that you have this gene and therefore you're going to have this phenotype. And while you're right, like, but that still has a really, like, fundamental place in biology. We still teach the central dogma for a reason. I don't think it's outdated. I think it is nuanced, and I think that as students and everyone's understanding of that central dogma increases, then you can start introducing the nuance. It's like when you're a kid and you're learning numbers. Like, first you learn 1, 2, 3, and then you learn, actually, it goes both directions. There are negative numbers. And then you learn there are decimals. I don't know their exact order anymore. It's been a while. But, you know, like, you build on things. You don't just immediately go, by the way, here's an imaginary number, which is the negative square root of I, or 1. Like, wait, what? You know, like, you don't start with the most complex concepts. Like, these basic concepts are still valid for most of the time. And I think that that's something that was a little overemphasized in the book. That they
So you're not teaching the central dogma as some sort of conspiracy to keep your undergraduate students in the dark.
Shh,
Okay.
not supposed to tell them.
Yeah.
What if they're watching? I'm just kidding. This is an alumni thing, so I don't think they are. Yeah, I do think that was very overplayed, and I was just like, I mean, okay, you're right. Yes, it is more nuanced than that, but also, like, that is the foundation of what natural selection can act upon, so that you can have more well-adapted organisms. But what's really fascinating about that, and this is kind of what I've become fascinated with research recently, is just this idea that there can be multiple forms that are highly selected for, or are equally fit, as the biologists in me wants to say. They will do equally well in an environment and have, you know, very different phenotypes. I think the violets are a really great example of this. I have no idea, like, what actually causes the difference in these colors of violets, because I saw them for the first time last week. So, like, I don't know. But it's something that's really interesting because it seems to be maintained. They exist side by side. There doesn't seem to be, like, some major, like, differentiation in their, like, ecological, like, requirements or anything like that. And so, yeah, it's interesting how you can have these multiple forms that are equally selected for. But all of that comes from this foundation of mutations. And you have to have, yes, while most of them don't matter, and a lot of them happen in non-coding parts of the DNA anyway. So, like, it really doesn't matter, at least non-coding to our current understanding. We'll give that asterisk. But like, it still is the fundamental foundation of even being able to have natural selection, much less this idea that it's direct intentional. Anyway, yes, that drives me nuts whenever the students write that and they're like, yes, they, it's just the way it's worded, and it just makes it sound like, yes, this plant decided that it would be much better off if it grew taller than that tree over there, so that it did. It's like,
Yeah.
no, it was just reaching for light.
I definitely also picked up on, yeah, it did come across as kind of this intentional evolutionary kind of changes. And I was like, wait, what? And I reread those chapters, like, it seemed like a lot, because I was like, is this really what you're trying to say? And I kind of was willing to cut him some slack. I was like, maybe it's just how you're writing it, but yeah. And then, yeah, reading that mutation was like the least important. I was like, oh, well, that's the opposite of what I learned, but okay. Willing to go along with this and see where we're going. But yeah, no, one thing that was interesting to me, and Carrot, you touched on it with just the maybe the bees are seeing the flowers in the same shade. So like, and it just when the book was talking about phenomenology, that just made me have flashbacks of like my very first religion class at Southwestern and trying to wrap my little freshman brain around the idea of phenomenology and of kind of maybe that we're kind of, what is the world? Like, what is it the same kind of material thing for everybody, or is it what you experience, or can it be a little bit of both? And so this book, I was like, okay, I'm glad you're touching on it, but it definitely was kind of giving me flashbacks of that as well, and being like, oh, didn't know that we were going to be talking about this again, but let's do it. So I did like that though. And then, yeah, just hearing the bees and the colors, and are we even seeing the same colors? Do colors exist? He said that in the book. I was like, what? You're blowing my mind right now, but I see it. You have a point. Yeah, just this whole way of kind of thinking about. I did really like a lot of the kind of trying to bridge the gap between like mind and matter. I liked a lot of what he did there, and that really did resonate with me, of just so many times we kind of create this divide, and it's understandable. I mean, it comes from the research and the writings from the past, so it's perfectly understandable why we are where we are today with our thinking. But I really liked when he was trying to talk about kind of embodying the mind is embodied, and just how it's not this separate completely intangible sort of thing. So that definitely really resonated with me. I don't know about you guys.
Well, so I've got a couple of notes here where he talked about mind and cognition as processes rather than things. And at first I love that. I thought like, wow, that makes a lot of that was appealing on the surface. And then I continued to think about it and started to get wrapped up in, because he also says that mind and cognition are not things, but processes. And they are, I wrote down his term, structurally coupled with life. Okay, so he's saying that there are processes that I think fit into his definition of what is alive versus not alive. And I started to get wrapped up in whether this was punting or not, right? Like, this is an area where I'm clueless, and so if you've got more thoughts on this, I'd love to hear it. The thought experiment I started playing with was, again, sort of wrapping around to our earlier conversation on social media. One of the things that I love about Twitter in particular is when you just view the tweets sort of tumbling out, you see sort of thought processes. but at very large scales for all kinds of people talking together. And a lot of it, I venture to say like 95 to 98% of it is all nonsense, right? Some meme about a guy that found a shrimp tail in his Cinnamon Toast Crunch or whatever. But it's interesting to watch those thoughts sort of unfold. And that's, I just started thinking about like, what is this this idea of thought, thinking, and cognition, and consciousness being this process, and what does that mean for sort of the processes that we see, this group dynamic on Facebook or social media, and then taking this taking this experiment even further, what does this mean for what we call artificial intelligence and these computers that are perceiving things and reacting to them and are more and more becoming sophisticated to be able to make pretty sophisticated kinds of decisions. And then way off in the future, maybe way off in the future, what is, if we get to the sci-fi kind of point where we can download our thoughts and our consciousness onto the internet or whatever, what is that? How does that change this understanding of mind and matter? Any thoughts, or did I just ramble a little too sci-fi there?
I don't know the answer, but I also was thinking kind of at what point can we, if we do get to the point of like downloading our conscious mind away from our physical body, like how do we kind of resolve that with what Capra was saying? And then that, I mean, it's, who knows how close or how far we are away from that, but definitely seems like a direction we're going in. And I don't have the answer, but I also was thinking about that. I was like, okay, I like this idea of it being embodied, but what about when it's no longer connected to a physical living body in the way that I'm used to using the word living?
I don't know that I have specific thoughts on that, so I'm just gonna leave that to you guys.
You just nod along. I could ask an even deeper question. See if I can make everyone really uncomfortable. But so Capra talks about form being he gives us a little triangle of form, matter, and process, and then puts on top of that meaning, which he calls the inner world of reflective consciousness. Earlier, before he talks about that, when he talks about consciousness, he talks about it being a special kind of cognition that to the best of our understanding, or at least the way I read it, that it's a pretty human phenomenon, that he seemed to be pretty judgy in saying that, a dog or a dolphin or a plant, or there's all kinds of other living things that aren't thinking and being conscious in the way that people are. And so, yet, his solution in some of the later chapters, especially thinking about biotechnology and globalization, is to recognize that humanity is part of life, wholly defined, right? Or part of the biosphere, Gaia, whatever you want to call it, whatever he might call it. And so, that seems kind of conflicted to me, and led me to the question, sort of, what is the human position in terms of life? So I'm not going to ask what is the meaning of life, but I'm going to ask, where do we fit in the hierarchy of things? Is there a hierarchy, or is there not? And people are just one of the animals and one of the living things out there. Capra seems to suggest both over the course of several different chapters.
So
go ahead.
I was just going to say, so kind of tying back a little bit to bias, I think I read it a little bit more where I did see kind of where he was for a while talking about like humans as somewhat separate, but then when we got to like the point with chimpanzees and talking about like greater apes and the ability to use similar types of language as us, even if it's more like sign language or something, that definitely fit in with my view of like, oh, we're definitely just animals and we're really great like animals, but like that's, you know, human, there's not this hard divide. So I definitely kind of finished reading that part thinking that he had in his mind and in his theories kind of had humans placed back on kind of on the evolutionary trail of great apes. And then, yeah, so I definitely saw that as kind of more resolved at that point. And to me, that made me think that there's, at least from his point of view, he wasn't like mind and consciousness isn't something that could only ever be attained by humans. You could argue that it is now, you could argue that it isn't, depending on how you want to define it and what you think other species are capable of. But I definitely took it as like, there's no reason why we should be the only species that would be ever able to attain these things. But again, I'm very willing to say that that also tied in with like my personal bias. So that could be part of that at play too.
Yeah, I first encountered that idea of like human exceptionalism my first semester at Southwestern when I took Going to the Dogs. Shout out to Dr. Hobgood and oh man, now I'm forgetting names and I feel awful about it. But we had, yeah, we talked about that a lot, about this idea that humans kind of, and I saw it over and over again at my time at Southwestern, that this idea of humans are different than other species. And, you know, I personally wonder how many other species think that in different ways, you know? Like, just because we can't understand it doesn't mean that they don't have that sort of an experience. And one thing that is kind of, I don't know, I guess you could ask even more of an existential question about it is, you know, really the ultimate creature are non-living things. I want to say creatures, but they're not them. Like prions are like the most fascinating diseases because they're literally just proteins, or like viruses, which are still considered non-living and yet manage to replicate themselves and sort of give this facade of life. And you know, you could argue that those are the top of the food chain organisms because we have no way of dealing with them. But at the same time, like, can you even say that? Because they aren't technically alive. But I usually approach it with students as this idea that humans are ecosystem engineers. We are incredible at changing the environment to suit our own needs. And we have done so in extreme ways, for sure, for sure. And yeah, it is kind of interesting whenever people propose sort of both concepts when they're at first like, you know, well, humans are superior, but not always, or like maybe not, maybe they shouldn't be or something. Oh my gosh, this, I don't know if we have time for this anecdote, but when I was teaching at Trinity, we were right across the street from the San Antonio Zoo, and I took the animal behavior class there, and they were doing observations on fish, and someone came up. I see we have 5 minutes, so I should do closing comments, but this will be quick. So someone came up to one of the students, were like, "What are you doing?" And like was distracting them from what they were doing and talking about how like very religious things and all of this stuff. And so I just was like, I'm going to intervene and let my students get back to work. And I had a 30-minute conversation with this person, not even about evolution. I didn't even try to touch that, just talking about that humans were animals. And he was just like, no, nope, humans are not animals. And then he went on to talk about how like animals actually worship God better than humans do because humans are flawed. And it was just really fascinating because it was just like all of these ideas that were like kind of in contrast to each other. Yeah, it was just it was fascinating. But anyway, like closing comments, I actually wanted to point out near the very end of the book, there was something that really kind of bothered me about when he was talking about feminism and ecological thought, because I'm going to read this part because I was just like, really? He says, at the deepest level, feminist awareness is based on a woman's experiential knowledge that all life is connected and that our existence is always embedded in a cyclical process of nature. And I'm like, why is that limited to women? Like, I don't understand, like, why that, like, you're trying to say something and you're kind of shooting yourself in the foot in your attempt to say it. So yeah, that was my closing thought. You tried, and no.
Well, I
No.
appreciate it. I'll take that as an endorsement that just because I'm a man doesn't mean I want to go out and kill and destroy things, right?
You can absolutely be in touch with nature. I believe in you.
I grew up, I became an ecologist. I do it for a living. So, yeah, we didn't talk a whole lot about the connection between the framework and the last couple of chapters, and to what extent the I'll call them case studies at the end connect to the chapters, and to what extent this idea of biology, cognition, and sociology sort of triad, and this idea of networks can really help us develop recommendations to deal with these grand challenges of globalization. And so I guess we'll leave that for the next book discussion, round two. But one quote that I really found really fascinating. I thought his strongest case study, the strongest connections he drew was in the leadership of management of organizations chapter. And I will shout out to Doctors O'Neill in political science and Dr. Parks in the business department, because I took leadership classes with both of them and spent a good year talking about differences between leadership and management, and what makes a leader, and what makes a strong leader, what makes a strong manager. And I thought Capra's chapter on the management of organizations was really strong in this regard. And a quote that stuck with me was this idea that people don't resist change. They resist change being imposed upon them. Was really strong. And I think, I think there's plenty to be discouraged about in the news, and on Facebook, and how your family members are acting on Facebook and things like that. But thinking about this idea, people don't inherently resist change. What they resist is change being imposed upon them, is actually a really encouraging message and an encouraging reminder, because I think this circles back around to topics of diversity and bias and different perspectives that we've talked about here today. Rather than just imposing these ideas on others, whether your idea is right or just or not, having dialogues and exchanging information, and talking about motivations about change and why change really seemed like a strong recommendation and a really hopeful way to go.
It looks like we're out of time, but I also really liked that line a lot, Matt. That definitely resonated with me as well. I was like, yes, that is so true for an organization of any size. I've seen it with little businesses, but then you can see it with the nation and the world at large. So you can take it at kind of any level that you want. Everything changes, but if you try to just push people, and especially if they don't understand the why and why they should care, you can't just force it.
All right, well, I would like to thank each and every one of our panelists for tonight's discussion. I was riveted the entire time, as I'm sure our attendees were, considering the conversation just drove itself. I really, really do appreciate everything that you guys brought to it. I think we've got a really great piece that we're going to be able to put on our on-demand streaming page, so anyone who wasn't able to attend today can still tune in and see the great effort that you put into this. I really appreciate your involvement and look forward to any collaboration again in the future. So thank you so much for being here and for giving back to university in this manner. Thank you all for attending as well, attendees, and we look forward to meeting again. Thank you.
Right.
Thank you
Thank y'all.
for having us.